My husband didn't tell me he sold the company. He just walked into our kitchen on a Tuesday morning, kissed my forehead, and said he had meetings all day. What he didn't say was that he'd just signed papers transferring $40 million into an account I didn't know existed. I found out 3 weeks later when his mistress called me, drunk and crying, asking where her promised condo was. That phone call didn't break me. It clarified everything. My name is Arlene Whitmore, and I'm about to explain how silence became the most expensive mistake my husband ever made. Brandon and I met 11 years ago at a tech conference in Seattle. I was working as a junior software engineer at a struggling startup. He was pitching investors on his idea for cloud-based inventory management software. I remember thinking he had charisma but no technical depth. He asked me out for coffee. I said yes because he seemed harmless. 6 months later, we were married. 2 months after that, I quit my job to help him build CoreStream solutions from our garage. I wrote the first version of the software myself. Brandon handled sales and investor relations while I spent 18-hour days debugging code and building features. We had no money for developers, so I became the entire engineering department. When our first client signed on, a regional warehouse chain, Brandon took the credit during the pitch. I didn't mind then. I thought we were building something together. I thought partnership meant his wins were my wins too. By year 3, CoreStream had 12 employees and $2 million in annual revenue. Brandon hired a chief technology officer named Felix Crane, a sharp guy from Boston who actually understood the architecture I'd built. Felix reported to Brandon, but he and I worked closely on product development. During code reviews, Felix would say, "Whoever built this foundation was brilliant." I never told him it was me. Brandon had introduced me to the team as his wife who helped out with early testing. The company grew fast. By year 7, we had offices in 3 cities and 40 employees. Brandon moved us into a house in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage. I started handling operations and vendor relations while Felix managed the engineering team. At company parties, investors would ask Brandon about the origin story. He'd talk about his vision, his risk-taking, his sleepless nights. I'd stand next to him, smiling, holding a glass of wine, invisible. Last October, Brandon started acting strange. He'd take calls in his car. He'd close his laptop when I walked into his home office. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd kiss my cheek and say business was stressful. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was not reading the shareholder agreement I'd signed 8 years ago when Brandon restructured the company for investor funding. I'd signed it at our kitchen table while making dinner. Brandon said it was just paperwork. The call came on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. I was at the grocery store when my phone rang from an unknown number. A woman's voice, thick with alcohol and tears, said, "Is this Arlene?" I said yes. She said, "I'm Vanessa. I've been seeing your husband for 9 months. He promised me a condo in the city once the sale went through. But now he won't return my calls." I stood in the cereal aisle, frozen, holding a box of granola. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked to my car and sat in the parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. Vanessa had said, "The sale." What sale? I drove home and went straight to Brandon's office. His laptop was open. I'd never snooped before, but I wasn't the same person who'd walked into the grocery store an hour ago. His email was open. The most recent thread was with someone named Hugh Mitchell from Apex Ventures. Subject line, "Final wire confirmation." I scrolled through the emails. My hands weren't shaking. They were steady, cold, efficient. The thread went back 4 months. Apex Ventures was acquiring CoreStream Solutions for $42 million. The deal had closed 3 weeks ago. Brandon had sold the company I'd built from scratch, and he hadn't said a word. I searched for my name in the email chain. It appeared once, in a document labeled Non-Essential Personnel Transition Plan. I was listed under administrative staff. I didn't confront Brandon that night. I cooked dinner like always. When he came home at 7, I asked about his day. He said it was fine, nothing special. We ate pasta and talked about a vacation we were planning for next month. He said he wanted to go somewhere tropical, maybe the Caribbean. I smiled and said that sounded nice. After dinner, I told him I had a headache and went to bed early. I didn't sleep. I laid there planning. The next morning, I called Felix Crane. I asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. He sounded surprised but agreed. We met at a cafe downtown at 10. I didn't waste time. I said, "Felix, did you know Brandon sold the company?" His face went pale. He put down his coffee cup. He said, "What are you talking about?" I showed him the emails on my phone. He read them twice. Then he looked at me and said, "Arlene, this can't be legal." Felix explained that when the company was restructured 8 years ago, Brandon had issued shares to early employees as part of their compensation. Felix owned 3%. 2 other senior engineers owned 2% each. Brandon owned 85%. The remaining 8% was held in a trust for future hires. But here's what Brandon didn't know. The shareholder agreement required majority shareholder approval for any sale over $10 million. Brandon needed signatures from shareholders representing at least 90% of shares. I pulled up the shareholder agreement on my phone. Brandon had emailed it to me years ago for records. I'd never read past page 1. Felix and I read it together in the cafe. Section 12, subsection 4. Any transaction exceeding $10 million requires written approval from shareholders holding no less than 90% of issued shares. Felix looked at me. He said, "Brandon only owns 85%. He needed our signatures." I asked, "Did he get them?" Felix shook his head. I spent the next 2 days making calls. I reached out to the 2 other engineers who owned shares, a woman named Paula Torres and a man named Vincent Shaw. Both still worked at CoreStream. Neither had been told about the sale. Paula was furious. Vincent was confused. I explained that Brandon had violated the shareholder agreement by selling without their consent. I asked if they'd received any paperwork about the acquisition. Both said no. Brandon had forged ahead without them. I needed a lawyer. I called my college roommate, Diana Frost, who practiced corporate law in Chicago. I explained the situation in detail. Diana listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Arlene, if what you're telling me is accurate, the sale is voidable. The minority shareholders can challenge it." I asked what that meant. She said, "It means you can potentially unwind the deal or force a renegotiation where the minority shareholders get compensated properly." Diana flew out to meet with me, Felix, Paula, and Vincent. We gathered at Diana's hotel conference room on a Saturday morning. Brandon thought I was at a yoga retreat with friends. Diana laid out our options. Option 1. We could sue Brandon for breaching the shareholder agreement. Option 2. We could go directly to Apex Ventures and inform them the sale was unauthorized. Option 3. We could negotiate with Brandon privately. Felix said, "What happens if we go to Apex?" Diana smiled. "They'll panic. They'll freeze the payment." We decided on option 2. Diana drafted a letter to Hugh Mitchell at Apex Ventures. The letter explained that Brandon Whitmore had sold CoreStream Solutions without obtaining proper shareholder approval as required by the company's governing documents. It stated that the minority shareholders, representing 15% of the company, were disputing the transaction. It requested that Apex immediately halt any remaining fund transfers until the matter was resolved. Diana sent the letter via email and certified mail on Monday morning. The response came faster than we expected. Hugh Mitchell called Diana's office within 3 hours. He was furious. He said Brandon had represented that he had full authority to sell. He said Apex had already wired $30 million of the $42 million purchase price. The remaining $12 million was held in escrow pending final employee transitions. Diana told Hugh that the sale was invalid without minority shareholder consent. Hugh said he'd be contacting his lawyers immediately. Brandon came home that night looking like he'd seen a ghost. His tie was loose. His shirt was wrinkled. He poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. I was chopping vegetables for dinner. I asked if something was wrong. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. He said, "Did you talk to Felix?" I stopped chopping. I turned to face him. I said, "Yes. I talked to Felix, Paula, and Vincent. I also talked to Apex Ventures." Brandon's face went from white to red. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He shouted, "What did you do?" I stayed calm. I said, "I informed them that you sold a company without proper shareholder approval. I informed them that the sale violated our shareholder agreement." Brandon slammed his hand on the table. He said, "You had no right. This is my company." I put down the knife. I said, "Actually, Brandon, it's our company. Mine, Felix's, Paula's, and Vincent's." Brandon tried to fix it. He called an emergency meeting with all shareholders. We met at CoreStream's main office on Wednesday evening. Brandon stood at the head of the conference table and apologized. He said he'd made a mistake in his rush to close the deal. He said he wanted to make things right. He offered Felix, Paula, and Vincent each $100,000 to sign off on the sale retroactively. Felix looked at me. I shook my head. Felix said, "That's not how this works, Brandon." Diana had done the math. Felix's 3%, Paula's 2%, and Vincent's 2% added up to 7% of a $42 million sale. Their combined shares were worth roughly $3 million. Brandon's offer of $100,000 each was insulting. But here's what Brandon didn't realize. I'd found something else in those old emails. When the company was first structured, Brandon had issued me 2% in shares as well. He'd done it for tax purposes. Our accountant had suggested it. I'd completely forgotten about it. I pulled out the original share certificate at the meeting. It was dated 9 years ago, signed by Brandon and notarized. My name, Arlene Whitmore, was listed as the owner of 2% of CoreStream Solutions. Brandon's face went gray. With my 2% added to Felix, Paula, and Vincent's shares, the minority shareholders now controlled 9%. Combined with Brandon's 85%, we had 94%. But here's the critical part. Brandon needed 90% approval. Without us, he had nothing. Apex Ventures threatened to sue Brandon for fraud. They demanded either we approve the sale or they'd pull out entirely and seek damages. Brandon was trapped. He came to me privately, in our bedroom, late at night. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want what I'm owed. I built that software. I built that company. You erased me." He said, "I'll give you half." I said, "No. I want my share calculated properly, and I want Felix, Paula, and Vincent compensated fairly." We restructured the deal. Diana negotiated directly with Apex and Brandon's lawyers. The $42 million was redistributed. Felix, Paula, Vincent, and I each received our proportional shares based on ownership. My 2% was worth $840,000. But Diana found another leverage point. I could claim I'd been an uncompensated co-founder whose equity had been diluted illegally. After 3 weeks of negotiation, I walked away with $4 million, a formal apology from Brandon in writing, and a divorce settlement that gave me the house. Brandon kept his millions, but he lost his marriage and his reputation. 6 months later, I started my own software company. This time, every founder's name is on the website. And I read every single document before I sign.